Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the second webinar hosted by Mediation Initiative. Now, today we have with us Mr. Sudhir Kalyanikar, who is going to talk about mediation and vendor and contracts management. Before we go ahead with that, I just want to talk to you about what mediation is. So mediation is a process of alternate dispute resolution. And in this process, what happens is a neutral third party, he attempts to resolve the dispute before him of the disputants through discussions, bringing them together through reflections, by asking them really incisive questions, helping them to think about their interests and needs, and help them achieve a resolution to their dispute without going to the courts or through arbitration. Mediation is known to be extremely time effective and as well as cost effective. The reason why we have started these different webinars on mediation on these very specific topics is to help people understand how mediation can be employed in very niche areas of different work profiles. The first we had was conflict management for startups and how mediation can help there. Today we have with us Mr. Sudhir Kalyanikar, who is going to talk about contracts management and vendor management. So this is the objective of these webinars. And we as Mediation Initiative, we are mediation service providers. We provide mediation consultancy as well as mediation training. So we hope that through these webinars, we are able to communicate and impart some kind of training, or let's call it information sharing with all those interested in mediation. And hopefully the topics that we cover are useful to people from different areas of life and wherever they work. So today, just to give you a quick introduction to Mr. Sudhir Kalyanikar, he has a master's degree in microbiology and marketing and is an information technology professional with almost 25 years of experience in consulting, marketing and sales, and service delivery and operations. He has worked with tech giants like IBM, Accenture, HPE, and NSEIT. Today, he leads the vendor and contracts management for the IT department at Ultratech Cement Limited, which is a part of the Aditya Birla Group. And he is also a visiting faculty in marketing at Welingkar Institute, Mumbai. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sudhir to take the virtual stage and take us through his topic today. Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you, Mir. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. With your permission, I will share my screen. I have a very small PowerPoint slide set, actually a slide deck. And the reason I have this is because more for it to be a kind of a guideline for me, make sure that I stay on track. Like you introduced, I am a visiting faculty and we tend to sometimes ramble on. So hopefully this will make sure that I don't do that. So thanks for the introduction. And I am going to speak a little bit about mediation in vendor and contracts management. So this is a very quick bio, which is what Mir also talked about. I'm not going to go too much into it. The only thing that I want to say out here, basically two things I want to say out here. One is that I am not a lawyer. Okay, and I have got a few what I call case studies, but you will find that those are more corporate kind of case studies, not legal kind of a case study. So one, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a corporate slave. So my examples, my case studies will also borrow from my corporate experience. That's point number one. Point number two is, again, talking about, let me actually move to the agenda. So talking about these case studies, which I'm going to share with you, they might sound a little simple or even simplistic to you. The point is, see, as corporate people, these are more the exceptions to us rather than the rule, right? We are more focused and we are more engaged in carrying out day-to-day activities and making sure that what we do is also it just happens quickly. We live on a day-to-day basis, week to basis. very few of our problems actually spread over a period of time, over a period of weeks or months. So if you find that the case studies or what I'm talking about seems to be very short term, especially if you're in the legal profession, just bear with me because this is what I'm able to borrow from my experience. Having said that, this is what I thought we will go through very quickly. I am not going to spend too much time on the first three. What I want to do is give you a context of what is vendor management, because terms like vendor management, terms like contract management are they're open terms. I mean, they're subject to, within reasonable boundaries, they're subject to a lot of interpretation, right? So I want to give you a context of what vendor management means to me, to my profession, to our team, the one that talk about. Same thing with contracts management. And that's what I'm going to basically talk about. I'm not going to make it a textbook definition kind of a thing, though you will find the definition also on the slide. Then I have picked up 4 experiences in my life where we had some kind of a mediation happening. It wasn't a formal mediation. It was more internal and informal mediation, but some kind of mediation did happen, and how that helped us solve these problems. Not all of these problems were solved in the way that people expect problem solutions to happen, but yes, we did come to a conclusion, right? And then finally, I'll spend a couple of minutes on what I feel personally, what are the learnings from these, from my life experience, and how I feel mediation really helps, right? So jumping right on, what is vendor management? Now, if you look at a textbook definition for vendor management, this is what it says. So it's a term that describes the processes organization use to manage their suppliers, who are known as vendors or partners, right? Like I told you, this is a very generic and a very all-encompassing kind of a definition. And that's what usually happens when we have terms like something management. So change management, time management, vendor management. It means different things to different people. Let me put it in the context of what I and my team do. So for my organization, what we do is we help to identify the right vendors for the right kind of roles. And since we are part of IT, this usually takes the form of which is a vendor who has the best kind of skills for a particular technology, or who has the expertise in a particular technology, and so forth. Again, I'm keeping it very simple, but I can talk for hours on these things. The next thing we do is, out of the vendors identified, we evaluate which are the top 3-4 vendors that we should be engaging and working with. We maintain a database of these vendors. We maintain a database of all vendors, but these would be specifically where we have asked them to either share a presentation or come and present in person, and so on. And we know what they are capable of, at least on paper. We engage with them when there is a specific requirement. So if there is an RFP, if there is any kind of requirement, we talk to them, we engage them, and we say, okay, this is what we would like you to bid on, or this is like what we would like you to propose a solution on. Okay. Once they're done with that and we award the contract to them, what we do is get them on board and work with them to actually see what is it that they can do. The contracting happens. Onboarding is more in terms of what is the vendor's, all the logistics of the vendor. Contracting is actually getting the contract in place. Okay. We also then we monitor them regularly in terms of whether they or not they are giving the service that they are expected to give, whether they are giving it at the levels at which they are expected to give. We do risk management. Risk management is also important. Risk management is, do you have one vendor doing everything for you, or do you have multiple vendors? There are pros and cons to both. For a particular requirement, do you want to go with only a single vendor, or do you want to go with multiple vendors? Let me give you a very simple example that's happening right now. You might have heard that there is a global chip shortage, and if you order a laptop today, it might take anywhere between 2 to 3 months to get it. It's not like you go, there are some laptops available ready, but if you want a specific configuration or something like that, you might have to wait for a long time. Now, can this kind of a risk be managed by having multiple vendors? Maybe not this particular thing, but yes, multiple vendors can be an option to manage risk. Sometimes a single vendor can be an option to manage the risk because the vendor is very closely tied with you. And then you have obviously vendor performance, which means how are they performing? We actually rate them on scales. We have tiers of vendors, platinum tiers, gold tiers, platinum being the best performing vendors, gold being next, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then very rare occasions where the project is over, we need to also do vendor offboarding, which means we have to say tata goodbye to the vendor and make sure that any intellectual property that they have created for us gets transferred to us. Any software that they have created for us gets transferred to us, the source code and things like that. So that is vendor management as far as the context that we do it in is concerned. Okay. Another caveat I want to just point out is that my examples will be taken from the software or IT industry because that's where I have worked for about 25 years of my life. So again, please bear with me because that's the domain I know best. Right. So this is vendor management. Why do we need vendor management? There are people who come and ask us, are you really required? Can't your organization directly speak to the vendor? Can't your IT people directly speak to the vendor? Yes, they can. But let me give you an example here. Let's take the example of a hospital. Now, a hospital might have some brilliant doctors. They might be excellent neurosurgeons or cardiologists or diabetologists or orthopedic surgeons and doctors like that. Now, what happens is that these are people experts in their own field, but a lot of such people do not, or maybe do not exhibit the capability to work with other people or to be in business together. There are a lot of things that need to be done to be in business, to have a mutually beneficial relationship. And IT is the same. We have a lot of experts. We have experts in technology, we have experts in Java, we have experts in SAP and other things like that. But my team forms a bridge with these kind of people. Sure, life will go on without us. But what we do is we smooth the rails for everybody to work together as a cohesive unit, right? Why does vendor management help, or how does it help? It improves us to select vendor. As we go through multiple rounds of vendor management, we realize that there is a particular way in which we can select some vendors. Some selection criteria are good, some selection criteria are not so useful, and so forth. Okay. Obviously, it helps save cost. A good vendor management process will speed up the vendor onboarding. If you know exactly what you need from that particular vendor, you can do it very quickly. Okay, I gave you the example of supply chain. I gave you the example of a chip shortage. That's called a supply chain base. Now, one of the companies that is not experiencing this to such a large degree is Apple. Okay, and why does that happen? Because Apple's vendor management or supply chain management is at a different level altogether. It's one of the best organizations which does amazing supply chain management. People who make stuff for Apple, usually like Foxconn, usually make it only for Apple. They are what we call captive suppliers or captive vendors. Okay, and when there is a shortage, Apple runs its own logistics. Most of the shortage is created by logistics. So Apple works in its own way. It has its own way of logistics. Similar with Amazon. You might be surprised to know that Amazon actually has about 100 planes of their own, which they use to ferry stuff from places like China. So a good supply chain organization will not be disrupted so much by global shortages if they have the supply chain in place. Again, this is a completely different and a very in-depth topic, but that helps. Good vendor management helps with that. Of course, you strengthen supplier relationships and you are able to negotiate better rates. Now, this is on the business side of it, right? There is an aspirational level to vendor management also called the vendor management office, which is not just vendor management, but it also looks at contract negotiation, looks at contract management, it looks at regulatory compliance, and that is what our team kind of does. Okay, we are not just vendor managers, we are a vendor management office because we help in a bunch of other activities. We also help in some HR related activities, finance, admin related activities, etc. Okay. Now I come to the other part of my portfolio, which is called contract management. So my portfolio says vendor and contracts management. Now, again, I'm going to use a textbook definition here. So what is contract management? It's a process of managing agreements from their creation to their execution and the eventual termination. Right? Very simple. I'm sure all of you know this. Why have I put this up again? Because I wanted to put the context here is that when I and my team come into the picture for my organization, yes, we are involved in the creation of agreements. Yes, we talk about commercial terms. We talk about what will be the penalty. We talk about what will be a late delivery or delayed uh, charges and all of that stuff. But the more important part is when the execution or the implementation phase of the contract is in progress, which means the contract is signed, everybody has shaken hands, and now it's time to actually deliver on the contract. That is when we come into the picture. Lot of cases, in most of our cases, honestly, we don't do a lot of contract management, because once the contract is signed, if both the vendor and the customer are on the same page, the contract just lies in a drawer somewhere or in a cupboard somewhere, and nobody touches it for the period of the contract, 5 years, 10 years, nobody is even picks up the contract. I have known of cases where we picked up the contract only to check when exactly is it expiring, because there was a dispute on that. Not a dispute. Somebody said it was 31st of March. Somebody said it's 30th of April. So we said, let's open the contract and actually check what it is. Right. So that's the level at which most people operate. But there are times when we need to touch the contract. We need to figure it out and come back and say, what are we talking about? Thanks, Mir. Yes, please. If you have any questions, actually feel free to interrupt me also. It's a small group, so we could make this more conversational as well. I'm more than happy. So coming back to contracts management, what exactly do I and my team do when it comes to contract management? We help our organization to digitize and store contracts. Now, I know this sounds very boring, but it's actually a very important thing. It's not very easy to. Here, I was wondering, is there some way in which I can, sorry. We are a central repository for all the contracts. What happens is, it's not easy. It's not just important to digitize and store the contracts, but it's also important that they are in a place from where you can access them easily, and they are in a place where you can search them easily. Now, a lot of old contracts are actually contracts which were made on paper and then scanned. That becomes a little difficult, but we have figured out some technology which allows us to do this kind of work. Okay, we also give access. Now, access management sounds very simple, but what it means is different level of people in an organization need different levels of access. For example, if it's a financial contract, people in the finance department probably need access. People in HR probably don't need. On the other hand, if it's a people related contract, then people in the HR department need access, but finance maybe needs access, but definitely the logistics department or the marketing department does not need access. So things like that is what we define again in the software that we have. And we also track contract expiry. So as you see, we are not lawyers. We are not sitting to create the contracts. While I said we do contribute in that area, but it's more the administrative part of the contract rather than the actual the execution part rather than the creation part or the ideation part of the contract. Okay. Of course, we also track vendor performance. That is a given. I said that in the last slide also. We track vendor performance to make sure that whoever is the vendor is doing what they are supposed to do and not doing what they are not supposed to do. So that is obviously a part of our role. Right. Let me now jump to the first case study. Like I said, if you find it a little simplistic, please bear with me. Please understand that, I mean, if you're a lawyer, an issue or a matter could go on for years together. In the corporate life, it very rarely happens like that. I mean, if something goes on for a few days, my boss is on our backside saying, why is it taking so long? If something goes on for a few weeks, it's like already an exception. If it goes on for a few months, unless it's like a turnkey project, huge implementation, building a huge plant, building a huge kind of infrastructure, then yes, then it takes time. But most other work on the corporate side is usually day-to-day work. Right? There are the budgeting happens on a yearly basis, right? And planning and monitoring happens on a quarterly basis. So those are the kind of terms that we know more in the corporate life. So this particular case study is interesting because there were two parties to it. One was a service provider and one was a customer. The services were procured in around 2013, 2014. No doubt about it, services were procured. There was a purchase order, there was a contract signed, there was a work order, and both the parties agreed that the services were procured. Okay. The issue was that partial invoices were unpaid. So let's say the services were procured, for example, for 1 year, only 6-month invoices were paid. The other invoices were not paid. Very funny reason why were not paid. Okay. Now, the service provider got acquired by another company and they did not do anything for about 6 to 7 years. And all of a sudden in 2021, they sent a legal notice to the customer saying that, look, these invoices are unpaid, pay up or else, kind of a notice, right? So where was the issue? The issue was that on the customer side, the invoices were never received. The invoices were generated, but they were never received. And there was no proof of dispatch or receipt by the customer. Now, because it's a legal notice, in corporate life, a legal notice is like a red flag, a big red flag. Okay. If there is a legal notice, the lawyers get involved. Normally, lawyers don't get involved unless there is a contracting happening. They don't get involved. But once there is a legal notice, everybody panics. It is not something that people in the corporate sector are very used to getting. And they are also not very comfortable getting, to be very honest with you. Okay, so what happened here? The legal teams got involved and then they started arguing with each other saying that, look, there is no proof of dispatch, there's no proof of receipt. If you have not placed a demand on me, I am not obligated to pay. So that kind of language started coming up. And it got a little ugly because it was going on for a long time. This, I think, got resolved. Maybe for people in the legal sector, it is quick, but this got resolved around the end of 2021, right? So what happened then? First, how was it sorted? The first thing that is that there was a series of discussions with senior management of both companies. Now, the amount was not very great, but it was not very less either, right? So it was somewhere in the middle. So it was not going to be easy for both companies, but the customer here was kind of adamant. Okay, I would say that the customer really put a lot of weight back onto the service provider and said, look, you never sent us the invoices, we're not obliged to pay. But the discussions happened, and then the service provider also realized that, look, here is an organization which I would prefer to work with, not to have as my enemy. So what they did was they wrote off the unpaid invoices. And the funny part is the customer actually availed of other services from this service provider, and they're still availing of those services. So it's not like it was any kind of a acrimonious dispute or something like that. The customer just said, look, I'm not paying. The other party just said, okay, fine, we'll write off this amount. And probably also talked about getting some new business because it was an amicable solution, because it was sorted out so nicely. It took a little time, but it got sorted out nicely. The customer was also happy to give them business. Okay. Now, like I said, now this looks very simple, but believe me, in the corporate world, if it was just a phone call from the service provider saying, please pay my bills, and if they had met, this would have gotten sorted out over maybe one lunch and one dinner or something like that. But somebody in the service provider's organization realized that this was an outstanding for 7 years, and without realizing that for 7 years there's been no movement on it, it was because nobody has moved on it. They just sent a legal notice and it went on for a few months. Okay, now is this mediation? It is kind of mediation. Like I said, most of my examples will be internal mediation or self-mediation or whatever you want to call it. How would a mediator have helped here? Definitely at the point that a legal notice is sent, if a mediator comes in, it creates a different kind of an environment for people. Maybe we would not have had senior management waste their time about it. Maybe the normal people talking to each other could have done it. Maybe the mediation would have helped it happen much faster than what it actually happened. So these are some of the plus points that I see where mediation could have definitely helped in this particular case. I was personally involved in this case. In fact, I was personally involved in all the 4 cases, right? So here was one case where the customer triumphed and the customer said, look, we are not going to pay. And they stood their stand. And the service provider was okay because they knew that probably one, it is written off, which is anyway financially, probably it was written off a lot earlier. And finance does not wait for more than 2 or 3 years. They usually write off stuff. And the other thing is they saw potential in the customer for new business. So this was the case study. I call it old invoices because I find it funny that something that happened in 2013 and 2014 would come to somebody's attention in 2021. Honestly, we are not used to working at these time frames unless we are like an organization building a metro or the National Quadrilateral, Golden Quadrilateral or something like that. Yes, then it takes time. Okay, or sending somebody to Mars. I think that can also happen quicker. So yeah. So this was the first case. The second case that I talk about is it's called a software audit case, and this is interesting. I'll have to go a little bit into some technicalities, so bear with me. So what is the background? If you look at any big software provider, we call them publishers or a software company. Let's take the example of Microsoft. Let's take the example of Adobe. Let's take the example of most of the other big software firms. Okay, there are two types of licenses that you can purchase, and if you already know this, again, I'm sorry for repeating it. One of the licenses is called a perpetual license, and the other one is the subscription license. Now, what is the difference between the two? If you have ever used Microsoft Office about 5-7 years back, you would realize that it was something that had to be downloaded and installed on your PC or your laptop. There would be a license key for that installation and it would be tied to your PC. Okay. Now, I don't know how many people actually did it, but there were people who actually went and purchased legal copies. Most people just, they were dependent on the friendly neighborhood IT guy. But if you did purchase a original copy, you would get a license key which would allow it to be installed on your particular machine, right? Now, imagine an organization with 5,000, 10,000 users. Imagine 5,000 license keys, imagine 10,000 license keys. It would be a nightmare to manage it. So what organizations, what Microsoft does and what other organizations do is they give what is called as a VLK. VLK is a volume licensing key. So which means it's a single key which can be worked for thousands of users. Of course, the scope of mischief and the scope of misuse is very high here. So it requires a lot of administration. So this virtual key is usually known to only 2-3 people, IT administrators in that organization. While it makes things convenient, the downside of it is there's literally no limit. I mean, you can put as many licenses as you want. So let's say you have purchased 5,000 licenses as an organization. You have an agreement with Microsoft, and then you have gone and put 5,500 licenses. Now, Microsoft has the right to audit you. When you sign up for any of these agreements, it is an inviolable clause for them that they have the right to audit you. At any point of time, they can ask you to submit yourself for an audit and check if the number of licenses that you have are within the limit or are above the limit. Okay, so in theory, perpetual licenses can be audited. Subscription is different. Subscription is like subscription is different. Subscription would probably, if you're using Office 365, you know what is a subscription. It means that you pay on a monthly or a yearly basis, and Microsoft knows exactly what you're using. So, and that happens even for organizations. If 5,000 people are using Office 365, they know exactly who is using it. There is a dashboard, and it's simple. If we have purchased for 5,000 users, if 5,001 user comes on board, Microsoft knows about it, and they just start billing you for it. They start charging you money for it in that month, right? So subscription licenses are simple. They make life easy, but perpetual licenses can be audited. So there is a request that comes from the team to audit. Now, this is very simple. It's a very standard thing. The case that I'm talking about was where it got complicated for some very, very weird reasons. So let's look at the background. What was the issue? So this organization reached out to the customer and said that this publisher reached out and said that, look, we want to audit you. Now, how do they audit? What they do is they run a piece of their own software in your environment, in the organization's environment. And that software collects a lot of data and sends it to the parent organization. Now, this is never approved because this is like a virus. This is like a controlled virus. Okay, this is exactly what viruses do. This is exactly what Trojans do, malware do. If you have heard these terms, these are not good things in the IT domain. These are the villains of the IT domain. So this is these security audits work in exactly the same way that these malware do. Okay, like the way a virus works. To be very simple. Now, invariably, the audit is rejected on security grounds because the security policy will not allow for any other outside parties software to be run in the organization system. So this was the issue. This was issue first. The second issue was they sent a request. They followed it up. They followed it up for 4-5 times. And when they were not getting a response, they sent a legal notice. The reason they were not getting a response was that they were sending it to the wrong person. Like I said, very, very weird issue. Again, like I told you, in the corporate world, a legal notice is a red flag. A legal notice is something that creates a lot of panic among people. So sending a legal notice meant that the legal teams got involved. And then it started in terms of, it became a legal battle rather than a normal day-to-day kind of a interaction between a publisher and a customer, right? Repeated follow-up, no response is what I just talked to you about. How was it sorted? The first thing that one very sensible person in the customer organization did was they called up the publisher, their account manager in the publisher organization, and said, look, buddy, can we have a one-on-one discussion with it without the legal teams being involved? Okay. And this was difficult because once the legal teams are involved, as managers or as people involved in it, we are expected to have the legal teams available for every single meeting, right? Because you never know when things can take a turn. Corporate organizations want to avoid legal battles as much as possible. Most of the lawyers in corporate who work in corporate sector, their entire this thing is on trying to avoid legal battles. They just work their backsides off, making sure that the organization does not have to face a legal issue. Okay, so it's all prevention better than cure kind of a thing. So first they moved the legal discussion to a business discussion. Okay, then what happened in the business discussion is that the customer agreed that let's do an internal self-audit. We will not use your software, but we'll use whatever mechanism we have to do an internal self-audit. And if we find that the number of licenses are more than what they should be, we will reconcile it. Reconciliation basically means that if you're using 5,100 instead and paying for 5,000, you pay for the extra 100. Very simple. That's what reconciliation means in these issues. Now, this is very strange because when I heard of this kind of a discussion happening, I had two suspicions. One is that the publisher, the organization giving the license, knew that there was something wrong going on in the organization, but the method by which they had obtained that information was not above board. That method was questionable, which is why they were not able to give proof. Because the first thing that the organization said was, look, we know that you are using more licenses. So what will be the customer's response? Okay, prove it to me. And if the customer is not able to, if the publisher is not able to prove it, that's because they have received the information in a way which is not above board. They probably did some kind of corporate espionage, or they talked to a disgruntled employee or something like that. I don't know the details, but that was the first suspicion that came to me. The second suspicion that I got was that no organization agrees for an internal self-audit so easily, right? Which means that the customer themselves were aware that maybe all is not above board. Maybe we are not using 5,000, maybe we are using more. So they agreed for a self-audit. The smart thing was that they discussed it out and they said, okay, we will do a self-audit, trust us on it. And the publisher said, okay, we will trust you, but we need to see the results. And that's how this was sorted out. Again, two people talking to each other, very much what happens in mediation. There is an intent to resolve the issue, no intent to, drag on for no reason. And no, they were just discussing with each other and says, okay, some issues on your side, some issues on my side. Let us shake hands on somewhere in the middle. And I think that's what they would have done. I'm not privy to the exact agreement, but yes, when the reconciliation happened, my team was involved in, purchase of the additional licenses and stuff like that. So yeah, I am aware of this, not in this organization, but in a previous organization. So this was my second case, software audit. So here, how would mediation have helped? Again, the same thing. It wouldn't have taken so much time. Once we got a legal notice, if we had gone the mediation route instead of the two lawyers getting involved, time would have been saved. That would have been, that in my opinion is the biggest asset here, that a lot of time gets saved. The right people get involved, and obviously if the right people get involved, the right decisions happen, and they happen quicker. And that is very, very important for a corporate thing. I mean, if you want a corporate organization, if you want to be active in a corporate organization, if you want to touch one of their soft spots, time and effort is a soft spot for most corporates. They would like, all said and done, all the other things being equal, they would like to go with something that saves them time and effort. Money is also there, but time and effort. So this was the second case. I'll now move on to the third case, which is again very unique in my experience, because we don't come across these kind of cases very often in the corporate sector. As lawyers, maybe people look at these things, and there is a lot of conflict management that happens as a lawyer. I mean, it's the bread and butter of that profession. Whereas when it comes to corporate, conflict avoidance is what we try to do all the time. Okay, so talking about this case, let me give you a quick background. The service provider or the vendor was an international company, and they had some local India representatives. So they had people in India representing them. And I use the word very advisedly, okay? And you will realize why I use the word representatives. So whenever we get into an agreement, whenever a customer gets into an agreement with a service provider, typically the service provider will ask them to sign an end user license agreement or a master services agreement. We have to do it when we install any software. We have to click saying, I accept, I accept, I accept, without reading it. I don't know, maybe lawyers read it, but most people I know don't read it. But in the case of big organizations, they sign what are called master service agreements. Pretty much the same thing, but corporates get a little bit of concession in terms of how they operate. So an agreement, the US company said, you have to sign our agreement. The Indian company said, no, we will not sign your agreement. You have to sign our agreement. Ultimately, the representatives managed to get the agreement signed. It was signed in India, and it was the customer's agreement. This was signed. So far, so good. Now, here's where the problem starts. What was the issue? The issue was that these representatives, there were 3 of them, they quit the company, they absconded actually. And then after about 6 months of services, the parent company reached out to the Indian company and said, hey, you're taking our services. And as per the agreement that you have signed, we need to do something, 1, 2, 3. And the Indian company said, what the heck? We never signed this agreement. And we especially told you that we will not be signing with these terms and conditions. And then both the parties realized that what had happened was the India local representatives, who did not have the authority, had signed up with the customer agreement. And on behalf of the customer, they had signed the agreement with the parent company. Now, this was downright fraud. Okay, this was clear fraud. They had no right to do it, and they were defrauding both organizations. Obviously, the most obvious thing happened. There was a police case registered against the representatives by both the parties, the customer as well as the vendor, right? And what happened was the vendor said that, look, if you don't sign the global contract, we're going to stop your services. Now, this might sound simple, like stop services and move to something else. But imagine you are part of a huge organization and you are using, let's say, Office 365. And Microsoft says, look, either do this or we'll stop service. And tomorrow, all laptops go on a blink. There is no email. There is nothing that is happening. If the organization with, let's say, 1,000 employees wants to change to another platform for email, it is a huge change management exercise. Now, This particular software, if I remember correctly, was about telecalling. It was a call center kind of a software. The customer was a call center entity, and it was the very basic of their business. It was the basis of their business. So if services were stopped, their entire business would have stopped. This was not a good case for them. Okay, so Indian customer obviously refused. They said, "What rubbish? We have signed what we have signed. If your representatives have defrauded you, that is not our problem. That is your problem." Again, the international company said, "No, this is not how it works. We don't want to work with you." Um, back and forth, a lot of things happened. But then, how was it actually resolved? There was a series of proper legal discussions between the lawyers. They were trying to see whether they can fit the agreement, either of the agreements. Now, the problem why the Indian customer was not signing with the US agreement was there were clauses in the US agreement that dealt with US export laws. Okay, and US export laws, from what little I understand, uh, limit a company from doing business in other countries if there are certain highlights. I mean, if there are certain red flags. For example, if the company is anyway associated with terrorism, or if the company is anyway associated with nuclear facilities or things like that, they don't allow a lot of companies. I mean, you need a lot of clearances from their State Department before you can do business with them. There were also terms about European Union GDPR, and the Indian customer was simple. The Indian customer said, "Look, I don't have business in any of these countries. Why should I sign something that is global in nature when I am just not exposed to it?" So it went back and forth. Ultimately, the CEOs of both the companies had to get involved. And fortunately or unfortunately, what happened was both companies decided that, "Look, we cannot work on this. We cannot work on this agreement." So they decided to walk away. So the customer worked with the CEO and said, "Look, give us time to change to another solution. We will change to a different solution, and then we can work out, and whatever we have used, we will pay you for it." And because the CEOs got involved, there was a little bit of a good faith agreement that happened. And they said, "Yes, thank you very much. You've used our services. You can pay us for it." How they managed internally, I don't know, but it was already happening. The two representatives, as far as I know, this was just, I think, February of 2022, are still absconding. They've not, to the best of my knowledge, they've not been found, even though both companies have put cases on them, but they've not been found. Okay. Again, another excellent case study where mediation would have helped. I mean, I don't need to tell you how it would have helped. It is something, it's a ripe case there, that's sitting there for a mediator to just walk in and say, "Look, guys, let's come to the table and let's talk this out. What is your best case scenario? What is your worst case scenario?" See, again, I keep harping on this, but then it is so important. I mean, the time of a CEO is so important, right? The time of a CEO is so valuable. 1 hour of a CEO's time is several thousands of dollars worth of it. Was this whole agreement even worth that much? I don't know. So that is where all these points start coming in. If when you start looking at it from those perspectives, you start realizing that, look, it's not worth it to have an ego problem. And in all these three cases, if you look at it, the problem was more business-like. The problem was not about cultures. This was about a culture because the way they work in the US is different from the way they work in India. But it was not about egos or things like that. It was about problems which got complicated for no reason. Here, it's not the case, but the first two problems could have been avoided from getting complicated. In this case, yes, definitely, there was fraud. So it is a complicated issue, and it needs senior people to try and resolve it. But again, a case where mediation would have probably helped. I don't know, would it have helped in avoiding this kind of a scenario? But definitely, whatever conclusion was reached would have been reached much faster and much smoother. That's what I personally feel. So that covers 3 of my case studies. I'll just take a quick breather, wait for this thing, flex my hands, before I move on to the next one, which has to do with startups. Okay. Now, a lot of organizations, including my own organization, want to encourage startups, want to give more business to startups because it's something that they feel that we should do. We, in fact, at our group, we have a team whose job is to evaluate startups work with them and see how best we can do. We also have a strict no investment policy. So when we are working with a startup, we make it clear upfront that we are not going to invest in you. We will invest in your product, as in we will buy your product or we will buy your service, but we are not going to invest in you as an equity investment or something like that, right? So this is genuinely an encouragement kind of a initiative. It is not a get rich quick kind of an initiative. That is there. There are venture capitalists and those people do that. But this initiative I'm talking about is very specific to, it's more from a vendor management perspective rather than a finance perspective. Okay. So what happens? A big conglomerate, not ours, this is a different conglomerate, and the startup work together. They have they work on a particular solution, and services contract is signed for 3 years. The startup says, we are more than happy to have you as our customer, and sign up for 3 years. We'll give you a brilliant rate and all the normal goodies that come with any kind of a good deal. Okay. Where was the issue? All that sounds so good. After 1 year of working, the startup company changed their operating model. Operating model means that if, for example, you are providing a product and services to go along with the product, right? So you're providing a model. So let's say Apple gives an iPhone and it gives you a 1 year warranty along with that iPhone, or it gives a 3 year warranty along with the iPhone. And all of a sudden, after 1 year, they say, okay, now we are stopping the warranty services. We are no longer going to give you warranty, right? That's the kind of shock this organization got, because the startup company just changed the model and I said, look, I cannot support you for 3 years. I can only give you my product. Of course, they refused to provide the support as per the original contract. They said, we know we have signed the contract, but we cannot give you the support. I mean, you do what the heck you want to do. We will not be able to give you the support. Of course, all this happens in very polite, very polished language, but that was the gist of their message. Now, the problem with the customer was that the customer could have moved away. But like I said, change management is a really, really big issue for most big organizations. And they had some critical processes. Okay, they said these critical processes we have onboarded on your platform. We cannot afford for you to walk away. The startup was very, very adamant that no, we are going to, this is our model. Now that's a risk with startups sometimes, because they are very agile. They're very quick. The speed at which they work, the pace at which they work is very high. And because of that, they change much faster than large conglomerate. Now, if you look at a conglomerate, let's take an example. This is not that example. Let's take Reliance Industries, for example. They have multiple organizations against them. Our Aditya Birla Group, Mahindra Group, Tata Group, all of these have amazing number of companies under them. So what happens is, by nature, over a period of time, over years, these companies have developed their own processes and a pace at which they do business, right? So that pace is not very, it's not very quick. I'll be very honest with you, because we call them elephants. It's like changing something is like an elephant running at full speed in one direction, trying to stop that elephant, make that elephant turn and run again full speed at another direction. Believe me, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort for something like that to happen. In case of big organizations, it could take years, right, to change something and do it. So this organization was like, oh my God, how do we sort it out? The way this was sorted out was also very, very creative. Okay. So how was it sorted? The first thing, obviously, legal action was threatened. And the startup, being a very small organization, knew that they could not match the conglomerate for if it went to legal action, if it went to court. Okay. But the funny part was that that was not the most scary thing. Now, what had happened was the reason the startup was changing the operating model after 1 year was because they were getting another round of funding. And the people who were doing the funding were insisting that they change the operating model. So they didn't have a choice. They wanted the money. Okay. So some financial muscle was flexed. The CEO of the conglomerate actually knew the venture capitalists who were working with this. So he went and said, look, and the venture capitalists were getting a lot of business from the conglomerate. So that muscle was flexed and said that, look, if these guys don't support, I'm not going to support you. So it was like, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. This needs to go on. So finally, what was decided was that the startup agreed to provide support for 1 more year till there was a full transition to another vendor at their cost. So they said, we will help you transition to another vendor. Obviously, once you have them by the place where it hurts a lot, people are very amenable to solutions. So they took a solution. Of course, legal action was only threatened. I don't think anybody really thought of taking it to court. But very creative solution. I'm not saying it is the best solution. I'm not saying that it is a very ethical solution also. But think of it from the conglomerate's point of view. They thought all is fair in love and war, because I mean, these guys are just pulling the rug under our feet. We'll pull the rug from under their feet. So that's how this was sorted out. Again, if you ask me, there is a lot of gray areas in this one. Okay, and it is not something that people will talk about. It is not something that will be made into a business school case study. But it is interesting because these kind of things do happen. I mean, all of us are adults, so we know that it's not a black and white world. There are a lot of shades of gray. So again, mediation would have helped here. I don't know if mediation would have come to the same conclusion here, but one of the things that I find about mediation is that the solutions that come out are very creative. So this, for me, falls under the category of a creative solution. Maybe a mediator would have come out with a completely different solution, which would have helped both companies. Now here it was like one company holding the other one to ransom, because the the other company held them to ransom in the first place. So it was like, I don't know, a standoff, Western movie kind of a standoff, where one guy has the gun and suddenly the other guy gets a gun and the first guy's gun is lost. Something like that. It's not a very pretty way of operating, but yeah, it happens. Okay. So these were the 4 case studies that I had for sharing today. I have just one last slide before, and then we can move on to questions. So the last slide that I have is in terms of my experiences or my learnings in terms of what I feel, how mediation helps. I'm sorry. It's been a long, tiring day. First is in mediation, there is an intent to resolve issues. I feel most organizations or most parties who go for mediation go for it because there is an intent to resolve issues. That's point number 1, very important, because if that intent is not there, then I mean, nothing is going to work. Second is mediation is private and confidential. It avoids negative publicity. Like I told you about corporate organizations, like they don't like legal notices, they don't like negative publicity. Okay, so this becomes private and confidential, and even an arbitration or a legal case can have its own level of publicity. There is more control over the process and the output. There is more control for both parties and the mediators, right, over how the process and the output. That is not so in the legal system. It's not so, to the best of my understanding, it's not so even in the arbitration proceedings. The proceedings have to follow a very strict methodology. Of course, in courts, you have to follow an even stricter methodology and a stricter way of putting things over. Whereas in mediation, there is the chance of sitting down over a cup of coffee and saying, hey, why don't we think about this? And it will not be thrown out of court, to borrow a phrase. Creative problem solving, we saw in this case, there was creative problem solving, not the best solution, but it was definitely creative. I mean, I personally would not have thought of going and seeing that a startup, why is the startup changing? So somebody really smart did that, and they came up with the answer, and then they realized that in the answer lay the solution also for them. So they went with the CFO, talked to the venture capitalist and said, look, do this or else, kind of a thing. It was creative, not saying that I condone it, but it was definitely creative. It is flexible. Mediation leads to tailored solution. It's not a solution which either party might be thinking about, but it might be a very tailored solution which solves the problem very well. So if you looked at our third case study, the international vendor, the solution was walking away from the deal. Okay. Most people who entered that would not have thought about walking away. It took the CEOs to conclude that conclusion, saying that, look, walking away. Walking away takes a lot of guts. Walking away also requires a lot of authority. A mediator can talk to people in authority and put it up as a solution, saying like, if nothing else works, you can always walk away. That is an option, right? If you look at our second case study, the software audit, again, there was a tailored solution which said we'll do an internal audit and we'll give you the results and we'll work with you for that. Again, a very tailored solution. Now, I think this is a very critical point. Mediation sometimes brings out the real problem. So if you look at the startup case study, what you'll find that the problem initially seemed to be that the startup is changing their operating model. But what was the root cause? What we call a root cause? What was the root cause? The root cause was that they needed the money and they were being held to ransom by somebody who was giving them the money. So the real problem was not that they wanted to change the operating model, it was something else. And there was an underlying conflict in the way they were operating and the way they were being told to operate. So sometimes, even if mediation does not solve the issue, if it does not address the problem, it can bring out the underlying issue or it can bring out the conflict. And that itself, in my opinion, is a big plus to start with. Okay. And finally, it tells you that when you negotiate the next contract, make it a good contract. So that is probably one of the biggest learning from all of these 4 case studies that I have. When you look at the contract, make sure it's being signed. I mean, in the case of the international contract, make sure that the person signing it has the authority. Reach out to the parent company, reach out to the principals. In the case of the startup, again, do some due diligence, do some work about it, bring some very very tough exit clauses so that either party is not able to exit so easily without adequately compensating the other party. So that in the software audit thing, of course, there was no contract per se. That is a requirement. In the first case also, a good contract would have probably helped. So, I mean, it was a basic invoices thing, but then if the contract very simply had said that, look, if you don't submit invoices, we will not pay. Or if there is a disputed invoice, the first thing that you need to do is show proof that you actually sent us the invoice, right? So that's a very basic thing in a contract. But if you had done that, probably that organization would not have reached. I mean, they would not have wasted so much time and effort. That's basically the whole point that I'm trying to bring out here, is that you can solve a lot of problems for corporates by some effective mediation. So that's it. Thank you very much for being a very graceful audience, very patient audience, and I hope whatever I spoke has been of use and help. And I'm of course open to questions and any other discussions that we might want to have.
Thank you so much, Sudhir. That was really wonderful. So, I really loved your last slide. It talked about all the benefits of mediation and I know you have not gone through any formal mediation training, but it feels like you already have gone through it through experience.
It's common sense. That's all I'm saying.
It is, but you know how we say common sense is so uncommon, right? But yeah, so all your points, mediation is about creative solutions. It is voluntary. It is flexible. You have the control of the outcome in your own hands. It's not some third party like an arbitrator or a judge deciding the outcome of the problem. And one of the things that you touched upon is that it brings out the real problem in the dispute, right? And when you say you can negotiate a better or a good contract the next time, you can possibly even negotiate a better contract with the same party, and you can come out with a creative solution, and it maintains relationships. It sometimes even improves relationships, right? So these are all the benefits of mediation. It when the CEOs came in, of course it should not have gone to the CEO level, but mediation has the ability to cut through the bureaucracy, right? And hopefully come out with a solution before disputes reach any third party adjudicating process like arbitration or litigation. I just feel that mediation, if brought in at the earliest stage possible, can help people understand that it need not escalate. So here I want to ask you a question. What role does ego play in resolving disputes in the corporate world?
So I'll kind of twist it around and tell you that the absence of ego plays a very important role in
Okay.
resolving. It causes, most of the problems are caused by ego. I have been to so many meetings where by mere act of changing the two principals who were discussing something, we've been able to achieve a result which looked impossible to us on both sides. Okay, but then there has to be the understanding and the willingness from both parties to understand that my representative is actually not working in my favor. My representative is actually hindering the whole process. If that happens, if both the parties agree that look, it is in our interest, then yes, sometimes the results can be magical. But yeah, ego plays a lot of importance. It's a very important thing when we run into issues, and it's like one person, it's getting stuck with somebody just because that person's ego is not helping them to understand that there could be a another way out. They are just insistent. For example, in the first case, when we talked about the invoices, initially the people were insistent that if you haven't received the invoice, we're not going to pay you. And that is one way of saying it, yes. But then are you also willing to hear the other party's point of view? That is where I think a mediator would really come into the picture.
Right, great. That's an excellent answer. But we had discussed this some time ago, that people at a higher level in the organization, right? They have reached there with years and years of experience and training, and when I talk about experience, it's not just about their domain, but general life experience as well. So when it comes to conflict management, do you think that every person who is higher up in the organization, I know the answer to this, but still I would like to hear an elaboration from you. Do you think that every person who is a higher up in an organization, although he may have the domain skills required to be at that position, has actually any conflict management skills?
I wish it were that way. In fact, in most cases, what I have seen is people very high up in the organization contribute the maximum to the ego. And I have seen, but it's not a generalization. I'll be very open with you. It's something that I have seen happen more often than I would have liked. I mean, I feel that you are a CEO or a CFO or somebody who's reached that level, and why are you getting bothered with such trivialities which can be sorted out by somebody much junior than you are? But then it's also the other side of the coin. They are there, and they have their success uh, to boast about, and they feel that no, I am successful, so just because I'm successful in one field, I'm automatically going to be successful in all fields. Rarely works like that. On the other side, I've also seen people extremely humble, and I'm seeing people at CEO level who are so humble that you would not recognize them as being CEOs. And those are the people who just ask everybody to take a deep breath, calm down, and say, okay, can we approach it in some other way? So I have seen both sides of people. The earlier side of people, the ones who are experts in one field and think that, just because I'm an expert in this field, I can be an expert everywhere. They tend to cause more problems than they help to solve.
Right. I mean, we also discussed this where you said that some companies have a troubleshooter
Yes,
position,
yes.
where that person would come in and cut through the red tapeism in the
And the
organization.
troubleshooter is very rarely somebody at a high level, but the troubleshooter is somebody who is very experienced, probably a retired person, a retired professor or somebody like that, who has the authority to tell the CEO to shut up.
Hmm.
That kind of authority they carry, which really helps them, because otherwise they're not going to be able to troubleshoot at all.
Exactly.
If they're going to be overruled all the time by senior people, it's going to be very difficult for them to troubleshoot.
This entire exercise is basically to understand conflict management,
Yeah,
and mediation is a form of conflict management. It's a non-adversarial process,
yeah.
just to help bring about results and end disputes, right? So I just want to ask you, and is there a dispute resolution system in place in, or was there in any of the organizations that you have worked? And if there was, what kind of system was it?
So the answer to that is yes and no.
Mhm.
Uh, so let me tell you what wasn't there. There wasn't any resolution system in place for the normal business problems. You can see all the 4 case studies of mine were very normal business problems. Okay. So there wasn't any. It completely dependent on the people in charge and how they would work out an issue. So that was one. Where there was what is required by law. So for example, there needs to be a proper
A posh committee, maybe.
yeah, a posh committee is a great example, right? Or even other union kind of engagements. So those kind of where there is a legal requirement to have a dispute resolution process. Yes, there was.
Okay.
Very rarely was it to solve what we call business problems, and I mean what other people would just call general problems. But
Mhm.
yeah, business problems where the issues were more like how much time are we wasting, how much money are we wasting, how can we get this back on track as soon as possible, those kind of issues. So yeah, no, I don't think so. I don't think any organization had that kind. Yes, like I said, they had this troubleshooting as a profile, but that was more to help customers because things were not moving in the system fast enough. So if you're a huge organization, things don't move in the system as quickly as the customer wants. So if the customer is unhappy, these people usually move that complaint up the ladder very quickly.
Mhm. Right. And one last question from me. Do
Yeah.
you think that people at every level of the organization should get some kind of conflict management training?
Ideally, yes. Organizations can probably start with something which is, higher level to middle level, and then bring that so what you're saying is basically, can we get conflict management as part of the culture of the
Yes.
organization? Ideally, yes. It would be perfect. Not a lot of people would want it, though. I mean, at a personal level, they might say, okay, what is conflict management? For example, in my organization, we have first aid training, okay,
Mhm.
which is not mandatory, but anybody can take it. And a lot of people are not interested in taking it.
Correct.
It could be useful, not just in the organization. It could be useful in your personal life also. It could be useful when you're out with friends, with family, wherever. But a lot of people are not interested in taking that up. So conflict management, I would say, would also fall in that kind of a category. But yes, definitely up to a certain level and above that, the organization just needs to bring it as part of the culture. Most
Right.
organizations do, they just don't do it in a very formal way. It's a
Hmm.
very informal way of doing it.
Correct. All right. So that's the end of my questions. Now, we do have one question, and I don't know if you have the answer to that because I definitely don't. Kanchan Rajpal is asking, well, she works in a legal profile in contract management from creation to execution in an organization that deals in medical equipment.
Okay.
And she is asking if there is any kind of certification that she could take to get into the IT industry in the legal profile.
I don't think there is any certification specific to the IT industry. What I can tell you is that one of the things where IT industry focuses a lot is in intellectual property law. So if you had some kind of a certification or diploma or something like that in intellectual property law, IT firms would look at you more favorably as a as a legal expert or as their in-house for their in-house legal team. So that is one. But otherwise, I think the best thing that you do is you can network with people who are in the IT industry or search for it. I think one lawyer is as good as or as bad as another lawyer for the firm. So they would look more from if you have some experience of doing it for the IT industry, then that definitely helps. But if you are starting, uh, yeah, there is a lot of focus. I'll tell you what. See, I'm not a trained lawyer, but over years, as I have seen contracts happen, I know what are red flags. I know, for example, a limitation of liability is a red flag, indemnity is a red flag, intellectual property is a red flag. So anybody, being an expert in these kind of fields, IT companies might favor them. I'm not saying they will. I don't think there is a correlation. But yeah, it's a non-technical job in a technical field. So anybody with the right kind of qualifications is a fit, actually.
To add to what Sudhir has said, I think Kanchan, this would be like any other job
Yeah.
where if you have the skills and experience, they would look upon you favorably. But what really matters as far as a lawyer is concerned, I'm a lawyer myself, and what would really matter if you have your legal knowledge up to a certain point where you are able to advise people on legal issues and contract management in particular. Now, since you're working in a company that deals in medical equipment, so maybe you would get to a point where you are an expert in making or drafting contracts in your industry, and then people would look favorably upon you for those kinds of jobs. Maybe that would work for you. Anyway, if and we have Manisha and Subodh with us and Rohit with us as well. If you guys have any questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat box. I'll just wait for a few seconds. All right. It seems that we don't have any more questions, but I think that was a fabulous webinar. Sudhir, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge and experience. The case studies especially were particularly brilliant. I think learning from examples is an amazing experience. Those are real life examples, and they actually tell you what happens in the real world and where mediation could have been used. And I'm a big proponent of mediation, and it's lovely to see uh, somebody who uh, has not gone through the formal training like I have, but has had from his life experience and work experience, professional experience, learned about mediation and how to apply it. So it's brilliant to see that you see the benefits in mediation. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you to all the participants. And this is where we bid adieu to everyone. Have a very
Thank
good
you.
evening.
It was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me. And if what I have talked about has helped anyone, I'm really privileged. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. So thank you again so much, and we will see you in the next webinar, hopefully. Bye. Take care. Have a good night.